Buried deep in the bayou country of Louisiana lies a tale so disturbing, so deeply entwined with the cruel logic of slavery, that for over a century it was omitted from plantation ledgers and whispered only in the quarters of the freedmen. In 1865, as Union troops swept through the South, liberating one plantation after another, they stumbled upon a crumbling estate on the edge of a cypress swamp. There they found evidence of a secret too ghastly to fully comprehend, a secret written not on paper, but in the haunted eyes of its survivors and the unmarked graves hidden under tangles of weeds. This was the legacy of the monstrous experiment of one plantation owner, a saga of human suffering that had festered in darkness since 1859. It is the story of a young enslaved girl forced to breed with her own father, a macabre covenant of incest and cruelty, forged under the whip and justified by greed. Within the decaying walls of Macabre Plantation, innocence was violated, and family bonds were perverted into something unspeakable. The obsession of the plantation owner with increasing his human property led him down a path of moral decay, so extreme that even other slaveholders would have recoiled in disgust had they known. But they did not know. The horror was buried, sealed behind polite Southern manners and the dense veil of Spanish moss that dripped from ancient oaks. Only now, through whispered recollections and the pieced-together testimony of those who survived, can we begin to uncover what truly happened behind those rotting walls. In the spring of 1859, Macabre Plantation appeared tranquil to an outsider. Rows of sugarcane swayed gently in the humid breeze, and the grand manor house, once painted a proud white, was now peeling gray, its columns strangled by vines. Beneath that veneer of Southern gentility, however, a rot had already set in. The master of Bellefleur, Lucien Bellefleur, was a man weighed down by debts and desperate ambitions. He had inherited this Louisiana estate from his father, along with a dwindling slave workforce and a ruthless conviction that profit must be squeezed from every acre and every soul. By 1859, the international slave trade had been outlawed for over 50 years, forcing plantation owners to rely on the natural increase of their slaves to sustain their operations. Enslaved women were expected to bear many children, each new baby adding to the wealth of the master. Slave breeding was an open secret in the South, a practice discussed in ledgers and letters, with the same cold calculus used for livestock. And in the case of Macabre Plantation, this very calculus began to consume Lucien Bellefleur entirely. Lucien brooded in his study late at night, poring over his account books by lamplight. The panic of 1857 had rattled the economy, and though cotton prices eventually recovered, his own fortunes had not. He had mortgaged his land and even sold off a number of slaves to settle debts, thinning the population of his plantation to perilous lows. Now he saw only one way forward: increase his human property from within. If he could not afford to buy more slaves at auction, he would have to breed them. This was not a new idea. Many slaveholders viewed the fertility of enslaved women as a way to replenish their labor force, but what Lucien contemplated crossed into an abyss of moral depravity that few had ever dared. That year was fraught with tension. Rumors of a proclamation of freedom by President Lincoln, of abolitionist plots and slave uprisings seeped through the South. In October, news arrived of an abolitionist zealot named John Brown who had attacked a federal arsenal in Virginia, attempting to ignite a slave revolt. The shock and fear Brown instigated fueled widespread panic across Dixie, feeding planter paranoia that turned to ever more desperate acts of control. Lucien, like many others, became convinced that he had to tighten his grip on his slaves, utterly break them if necessary, to ward off any whisper of insurrection. It was in this atmosphere of fear and greed that a truly monstrous plan took shape within him. Far from the lamplight and scheming of the manor house, in a small slave cabin at the edge of the Bellefleur cane fields, Samuel sat with his daughter Emmeline at the end of a long workday. Samuel was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, his back and arms hardened by decades of cutting cane and tilling soil. Emmeline was only 16, a slender girl on the cusp of womanhood, with the gentle eyes of her mother and a shy smile that had grown rarer in recent months. Ever since Emmeline had begun to blossom from a child into a young woman, Samuel lived with a gnawing fear. He had seen the way some overseers and even Lucian himself looked at her. He knew what happened to enslaved girls of her age on plantations, how they could be violated on a cruel whim. He prayed desperately each night that fate might spare his Emmeline from that particular horror. Samuel told himself he could endure any amount of toil or pain, so long as his daughter was safe. But on this spring night, his father and daughter shared a meager supper of cornmeal mush by the dim glow of a tallow candle. Samuel could not shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. Emmeline noticed her father staring off, eyes distant, and gently touched his work-worn hand. "It will be all right, Papa," she whispered, though even she did not know why she said it, only that the silence had grown so heavy. Samuel mustered a weak smile for her sake. He patted her hand and nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He did not speak, the worries clouding his mind. He did not tell Emmeline that earlier that afternoon he had seen Master Bellefleur watching them from the veranda, eyes dark and unreadable. He did not mention the strange orders he had overheard Lucian instructing the overseer to clear out the old grain shed at the far edge of the property and secure its doors. Something was coming, some new cruelty, but Samuel could not yet imagine what it might be. The very next evening, his worst fears came true. An overseer appeared at the door of his cabin with a lantern and a loaded shotgun, announcing that Master Bellefleur demanded his presence. Samuel was led to the big house under the dimming sky, his heart pounding with dread. In the plantation office, Lucien Bellefleur waited behind a mahogany desk littered with papers and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He dismissed the overseer and fixed Samuel with an icy stare. "I have a task for you," Lucian said, his tone almost conversational. "A task only you can perform." Samuel stood silently, cap in hand, eyes lowered. He felt a trickle of cold sweat down his neck. "Your Emmeline has reached a fruitful age," the master continued, voice cutting the silence like a blade. "I intend for her to bear a child, another asset for this estate." Samuel looked up in alarm, his eyes wide. His worst nightmare was coming true. He thought Lucian meant to force himself on Emmeline. Before Samuel could beg for mercy, Lucian spoke the words that made the room spin. "You will be the one to get her with child." For a moment, Samuel wondered if he had misheard. His stomach lurched. Massa, she is my daughter," he stammered, barely choking out the obvious protest. Lucian's lip curled in a cruel imitation of a smile. "I am aware. You should be grateful, Sam. I could have had one of the field hands do it, or done it myself. But a child of strong stock from your line, that will fetch a fine price or serve me well here." Samuel felt faint. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Please, she is just a girl," he whispered hoarsely. "This is a sin. Begging your pardon, sir. It is not right." The planter's calm veneer fell away, replaced by naked wrath. "Do not dare speak to me of right and wrong," Lucien hissed. "You will do as I command. I own you and I own her. If I say breed, you breed." Samuel shook his head, tears of fury and despair welling up. He dropped to his knees. "Master, I beg you," he pleaded, voice cracking. "Whip me, kill me if you must, but do not ask this of us." Lucian's face went red with rage at this defiance. He rose so quickly that his heavy chair toppled backward. "Have you lost your ears?" he shouted. "I gave you an order, Sam." When Samuel did not lift his head from where he knelt, sobbing, Lucian snatched a riding crop from the wall and struck him across the shoulders. Samuel gasped at the searing pain, but still choked out, "I cannot. That was enough." Lucian stormed to the doorway and barked for the overseer. Two men came running. "Take this mule out and give him 20 lashes now," the master growled through clenched teeth. "Perhaps that will remind him who he is." Samuel struggled as the overseers dragged him out to the yard. They tied him to the whipping post in the glow of a lantern. The leather whip cracked through the night air, and his flesh erupted in agony. He did not cry out until the 5th lash opened a deep cut along his back. By the 10th stroke, he was screaming. By 20, he hung limp in the ropes, barely conscious, blood mingling with the dirt at his feet. Lucian watched from the veranda, his face a stone mask in the darkness. When it was over, he approached the swaying, bloodied figure and leaned in close. He spoke softly into Samuel's ear. "You will do it. Or by God, I will flay the skin off her back in front of you, and then still make it happen anyway." Samuel was untied and collapsed to the ground, trembling. 2 slaves from the quarters were ordered to carry him back to his cabin. Emmeline was waiting there, frantic. She cried out when she saw her father's shredded back and helped lay him on their straw pallet. That night, Samuel drifted in and out of a fevered haze, dimly aware of Emmeline's cool hands trying to clean his wounds and stanch the bleeding. She kept asking what had happened, who had done this. But Samuel could not bring himself to answer. He only wept silently, face turned away in shame. As dawn approached, he finally whispered to Emmeline the terrible demand Lucian had made of them. Emmeline recoiled as if struck. At first she refused to believe it, such a thing was too monstrous. She clutched his hand, both of them shaking. He cannot mean it, Papa," she said in a broken voice. Samuel could only lower his gaze. He had no answers, only an ocean of guilt threatening to swallow him whole. On the 2nd night after the whipping Samuel had received, 2 overseers came and escorted him and Emmeline to the old grain shed that had been cleared out. They shoved the 2 inside and barred the door from outside, leaving only a smoky oil lamp for light. Inside the stifling shed, father and daughter clung to opposite corners, trembling. His back was on fire with pain from the lashes, and her face was streaked with tears that would not stop. All night they sat in anguish, neither able to approach the other, when the pale light of dawn crept in through the slats of the walls. They were still huddled apart. Nothing had happened. Lucian was furious. If fear of punishment would not suffice, he was prepared to use punishment itself to achieve his aims. On the following evening, the ritual changed. This time, Lucian himself arrived at the shed, with 2 overseers in tow. Emmeline and Samuel were both sobbing before a hand was even laid on them. They knew there was no escape. At a curt gesture from the master, one overseer pulled a rough sackcloth hood over his head, and another did the same to Emmeline. In a grotesque mockery of mercy, Lucian attempted to blind them to each other, as if concealing the identities of victim and victimizer could somehow make the act more bearable. But it only added confusion to their terror. Emmeline let out a muffled wail as she was pushed to the dirt floor. Hooded and disoriented, Samuel felt the butt of a rifle press into his back, and the master snarl, "Do what you are told!" When he hesitated even then, a whip lashed across his legs, and he heard Emmeline scream in pain as an overseer yanked her skirts. Samuel tore the hood off in a frantic rage and managed to throw a punch at one of the men, but another slammed the rifle butt into his stomach, dropping him to his knees. The hood had slipped off Emmeline's head in the struggle. Father and daughter locked eyes for one harrowing moment, both faces masks of anguish. Then the men seized Samuel by the arms, under the threat of the lash and a gun barrel pressed to his head. He was forced toward his own child. "Please, no, forgive me. God, forgive us," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. Emmeline was pinned beneath him, sobbing and struggling weakly. She cried for her mother, for anyone. But no help came. Lucian stood only a few feet away, breathing hard. his eyes glittering in the lamplight as he watched the atrocity unfold. In that hellish moment, Samuel did what no father should ever have to do. With an overseer gripping the back of his neck like a vice, he gave in. A scream of ultimate horror tore from her throat and echoed off the wooden walls. Samuel kept whispering apologies into her ear until the overseer struck him silent. When it was over, the two were left on the floor of the shed, shivering and half-clothed, as the master and his men filed out into the night. Before leaving, Lucian told them coldly through the door, "It will continue every night until she is with child. You would do well to get it done on your own." Then the lamp was snuffed out, casting Samuel and Emmeline into darkness. They held each other in the black silence, both weeping, both broken in ways that could never be mended. In the weeks that followed, the plantation fell into an uneasy quiet. Emmeline and Samuel spoke little to each other. An invisible wall of shame and sorrow stood between them. Yet when it became clear that her monthly cycle had stopped and she began to feel the first waves of morning sickness, they held each other and wept anew. The girl was with child. The cruel purpose of Lucian had been achieved. Upon hearing the news, Master Bellefleur was pleased in his grim way. He ordered Emmeline to be given lighter tasks about the yard and kitchen, ensuring she carried the baby to term. For Samuel and Emmeline, the coming of the baby was a source of dread. What would it look like? How could they possibly love a child born of such a violation? Some of the other enslaved people on the plantation had begun to whisper of the evil that had occurred. Although none dared speak of it openly, a few older slaves cast wary, pitying glances toward the cabin where Samuel and Emmeline lived, making the sign of the cross or spitting to ward off what they called a curse. There was one kind soul, an elderly midwife named Auntie May, who visited Emmeline quietly in the evenings with herbal teas. She never asked outright what happened, but as she gently examined the girl's belly and listened to the girl's weak heartbeat, tears shone in the old woman's eyes. She had seen the bruises on her arms and the haunted emptiness in both father and daughter. Auntie May simply murmured, "Child, none of this be your fault. The Lord sees you and left it at that." Emmeline broke down sobbing in the midwife's arms that night, releasing a little of the pain that burdened her soul. As the months passed, her belly swelled with the proof of her violation. Samuel hovered anxiously, torn between disgust at what had been done and concern for his daughter's health. She was, after all, still his little girl despite everything, and now she was expecting a baby while scarcely more than a child herself. When Emmeline was around 7 months along, a sudden complication nearly took her life. She collapsed in the vegetable garden under the noonday sun, overcome by heat and faintness. Samuel rushed to her side, shouting for help, convinced she was miscarrying. Lucian allowed Auntie May to tend to Emmeline more closely after that scare, and the remaining weeks crawled by under a tense, watchful peace. Finally, on a muggy night in early 1860, Emmeline went into labor. They brought Emmeline to the same shed where her nightmare had occurred, as it was the only semi-private place available for a delivery. Auntie May and another slave woman boiled rags and heated water over a small fire, while Samuel paced outside in the darkness. Her labor was long and difficult. The girl was young and the baby large. Her cries of agony rang out into the night, renewing the torment for Samuel with every scream he heard. He prayed desperately to God, to his late wife's spirit, to anyone, to see Emmeline through this. Near dawn, after hours of suffering, Emmeline delivered a baby boy into Auntie May's waiting hands. For one terrible moment, the infant did not cry or move. Emmeline, drenched in sweat and tears, pleaded weakly, Is he alive?" Auntie May briskly rubbed the newborn, and at last a thin wail emerged. The baby lived. When Samuel heard that fragile cry, he sank to his knees outside, overwhelmed by relief and sorrow all at once. He was a father again and also a grandfather to this child of darkness. Inside the shed, Auntie May placed the infant into her trembling arms. Emmeline turned her face away at first, unable to look at her son. But as the baby whimpered feebly, something instinctual softened her. She gazed down at the tiny boy, taking in his crinkled brown skin and the shock of black hair on his head. Against all expectation, he was beautiful to her, innocent. Emmeline's tears fell onto the swaddling cloth as she cradled him. In that moment, despite all the misery that led here, she felt a surge of fierce love for her child. He was hers, and he was blameless. Outside, Samuel was allowed to enter at last. He stepped in, hesitantly, removing his hat. Auntie May looked between the exhausted girl and the trembling man, and quietly excused herself, leaving the little family alone. Samuel approached the pallet where Emmeline lay. In her arms, the newborn fussed softly. When Emmeline raised her eyes to her father, there was a flicker of something like forgiveness there. Samuel broke down, falling to his knees beside her. "He is beautiful," he whispered, voice shaking. Emmeline managed a faint, sad smile. She gently placed the baby into his arms. The old midwife peered in from just outside the door and saw father, daughter, and baby huddled together, their foreheads touching as they wept quietly, grieving for the past and praying for some scrap of hope in the future. Word of the successful birth spread around Bellefleur Plantation by the next day. Lucien recorded the new asset in his ledger. A boy, whom he impassively noted, was the offspring of Sam and Emmeline. The master seemed satisfied, even proud, as if he had proven his vile experiment a success. In the weeks that followed, he left the new mother and child relatively undisturbed. Emmeline was allowed a brief respite to recover and nurse her infant, whom she named Joseph. Samuel returned to work in the fields, but he would steal moments whenever he could to slip away and check on Emmeline and little Joseph. He often found Emmeline humming a lullaby to the baby or simply rocking him with a faraway look. Those moments broke his heart and healed it. At once he saw that Emmeline had found some love for her baby, a love he himself struggled to fully feel through his haze of guilt. But seeing his daughter gently kiss the boy's forehead as he slept stirred a protective warmth within him. Perhaps, he dared to think, they could at least shield this innocent child and raise him with whatever tenderness existed in their shattered world. That fragile hope was short-lived. By the summer of 1860, while Joseph was still an infant in arms, Lucien made it clear that he intended for Emmeline to become pregnant again as soon as possible. He had seen how well his breeding plan worked. One healthy birth was not enough. He wanted another, and another, a whole crop of new slaves born of his prized stock. When Samuel heard this, a cold dread filled him. He watched Emmeline closely when the overseer relayed the masteress' decree that in a few months' time, the breeding would resume. The girl closed her eyes and held her baby tightly, her lips quivering. Samuel knew she would sooner die than go through that hell again. In truth, so would he. Something hardened in Samuel then. He decided that no matter the cost, he would not allow Lucien Bellefleur to continue this horror. The greed of the master had finally crossed every line, and now Samuel saw only one way to end it. In the dead of night a few weeks later, Samuel crept toward the manor house with a resolve as cold and silent as the stars. Overhead, he had secretly fashioned a shiv from a broken blade, and he hid its sharp length against his forearm as he slipped through the shadows. In the months since Joseph's birth, Lucien had grown careless, believing his slaves too cowed to ever strike back. On this night, the master sat alone in his study, drinking heavily as a summer storm raged outside. Lightning flashed through the tall windows, illuminating a room lined with books and trophies, and the slumped figure of Lucien Bellefleur at his desk. brooding over some paperwork. He did not notice the dark shape of Samuel emerging behind him. His face was contorted not in rage, but in a grim, sorrowful calm as he raised the shiv. A clap of thunder shook the air at the same moment Samuel struck. The blade drove deep into the shoulder of Lucian. The planter cried out in shock and pain, toppling forward. Samuel lunged again, aiming for the heart this time, but Lucian caught his wrist with surprising strength. The two men struggled, knocking over an oil lamp which burst and set the edge of the rug aflame. Lucian, bellowing in fury, managed to wrench the weapon away from Samuel. He drew a pistol from a desk drawer, and as Samuel charged once more with his bare hands, a gunshot exploded. Samuel staggered back, blood spreading across his chest. He fell to the floor at the feet of the master. The household was awakening in alarm. The sounds of the fight and the gunshot brought the overseer and a few servants running. They found Lucian bleeding from his wounds and stamping out the small fire on the rug, and Samuel lying gasping on the floor. Lucian, clutching his shoulder, ordered the overseer hoarsely, "String him up!" At first light. Make an example. Emmeline, awakened by the commotion, arrived just in time to see the limp body of her father being dragged from the study, leaving a smear of blood along the polished hallway. She screamed and tried to reach him, but an overseer shoved her to the ground. Samuel was barely alive, but he turned his head at the sound of his daughter's voice. Their eyes met briefly in the dim lamplight. With his last strength, Samuel mouthed the words, "I love you," to Emmeline, before a rough sack was thrown over his head. They hauled him out into the pre-dawn rain. Emmeline's cry of grief rose above the thunder. As the sun broke over the cypress trees that morning, the slaves of Bellefleur Plantation were gathered to witness the hanging of Samuel. His bullet wound had likely been fatal already, but Lucian insisted on the spectacle. Barely conscious, Samuel was hoisted up on a tree branch in the front yard where Spanish moss dripped like funeral crepe. Emmeline was forced to stand in the front row, clutching baby Joseph to her chest as the body of her father was dropped. The rope snapped taut, and his suffering finally ended. His broken body swayed there as a warning to all. Lucian, his arm in a sling and eyes blazing with cruel triumph, addressed the assembled slaves. "This is what becomes of disobedience," he spat. Emmeline said nothing. She stood in the drizzle, numb, a numbness that would stay with her for a long time. The American Civil War erupted in 1861, soon after Samuel was executed. Distant cannon fire and the faint rumblings of conflict occasionally reached the isolated Bellefleur plantation. As the war raged on, life on the plantation carried a tense undercurrent of both hope and fear for the enslaved. They even heard that on January 1st, 1863, the president had decreed freedom for slaves in the rebel states, the Emancipation Proclamation, but on Bellefleur land, that promise was just an echo with no power yet. They heard rumors that Union soldiers were moving through the Louisiana backcountry, breaking chains. Such talk was treason in the eyes of Lucian. He swore he would kill any slave who breathed a word of freedom in his presence. Emmeline kept her head down and focused on keeping little Joseph alive through those lean years. The boy grew toddling at her feet, a thin child with curious eyes that were so achingly similar to those of his father. To Lucian, Joseph was merely a future field hand. Perhaps in the back of his mind, the planter even considered a more diabolical design. When the boy grew up, he could serve as a new stud, maybe even be bred back to his own mother, compounding the incestuous bloodline to produce more pure stock. It was an idea so ghastly that even Lucian spoke of it only in drunken mutterings to himself, but the very thought made her blood run cold when she overheard him one night. Truly, his evil knew no limit. By 1863, the Union Army had seized New Orleans and pushed up the Mississippi. The war drew ever closer to Bellefleur. Lucien grew anxious and crueler than ever. Food grew scarce due to blockades, and he lashed out at the slightest provocation. Emmeline did her best to avoid him entirely, tending to Joseph and dreaming of escape. But deep in the swamps of Louisiana, escape was nearly impossible, especially with a small child. So she endured, clinging to the promise that one day the Yankees would come. That day finally arrived in the spring of 1865. The Confederacy was on the brink of collapse. Union troops moving through the Louisiana backcountry to enforce the slaves' emancipation rode up the overgrown road to Bellefleur Plantation. By then, Lucien Bellefleur was a hollow shell of the man he had been wounded, bitter and half mad with drink and defeat. As the blue-coated cavalrymen approached, Lucien flew into a panic. He had no intention of relinquishing what he still considered his property. He grabbed his rifle and pistol and ran to the quarters, where Emmeline was in front of her cabin, clutching 4-year-old Joseph. Lucien roughly seized Emmeline by the arm. "Yankees are coming!" he snarled, spittle on his beard. "I will not let them have you or the boy." Emmeline screamed as Lucien dragged her and little Joseph toward the swamp at gunpoint. Joseph cried in terror. At the tree line, Lucien shoved Emmeline to her knees. He cocked the pistol and aimed it at Joseph's small head first. Before he could pull the trigger, a booming voice echoed from behind. "Drop the weapon!" A half-dozen Union soldiers had fanned out, rifles trained on the planter. Lucien spun around and fired wildly at them, cursing. A volley of gunshots answered. When the smoke cleared, Lucien Bellefleur lay face up in the mud, riddled with bullets and quite dead. Emmeline had shielded her son with her body during the shooting. Now trembling, she looked up to see the Union captain approaching cautiously. He lowered his carbine and gently asked, "Ma-am, are you all right?" Emmeline could not speak. She merely clutched Joseph and nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face. The nightmare was over. After 6 long years of unrelenting horror, Emmeline was free. But the trials she had endured were etched into her very being. The Union men escorted Emmeline and the other stunned survivors away from Bellefleur Plantation. They buried the dead planter in a shallow grave and raised the stars and stripes over the grounds as a symbol that the era of bondage had ended. Among the soldiers, whispers circulated about the eerie atmosphere of the place. Some said they felt an oppressive darkness there, without even knowing the details of what had happened. Emmeline never volunteered her story to those soldiers. She simply held her child close and walked away, not once looking back at the manor house or the hanging tree, where the blood of her father still stained the roots. In the months after emancipation, Bellefleur Plantation fell silent. The fields went unworked, the big house empty, slowly being reclaimed by moss and rot. Local folk began to avoid the property, saying it was cursed. Others swore that on mist-laden mornings they glimpsed the silhouette of a man hanging from an old oak limb, only to blink and find nothing there. Some nights, it was said, passers-by could hear the faint cries of a young girl and the anguished sob of a man echoing through the cypress groves, ghostly remnants of the atrocity that took place there. Emmeline carried those ghosts within her. She took Joseph and journeyed far away, determined to build a life where her son would never know the suffering of his origins. She never married, the scars of her trauma too deep to fully heal, but she devoted herself to giving Joseph a chance at happiness. Her boy grew up to be a free young man, never knowing the whip or the chain, a living rebuke to those who had tried to break his family. She found work in a river town under an assumed name, raising Joseph as a free child. Yet those who knew her noticed a sadness in her eyes, a distance that never left. Only once, many years later, did Emmeline speak of Bellefleur. On her deathbed, she whispered a confession to a kindly preacher, revealing the secret she had kept locked in her heart. Horrified and pale, the preacher wrote down what she told him, ensuring that this dark chapter would not be lost to time. And so the truth of Bellefleur Plantation survived not in official records or history books, but in the hushed recollections passed down in the community. For over a century, the tale of the slave girl, forced to breed with her own father, remained a forbidden shadow, a story to make even the bravest soul shudder. Now that it has finally come to light, we are left to reckon with the depths of cruelty that human beings can sink to, and to remember the innocent lives destroyed in the long nightmare of slavery. We cannot turn away from such truths, however horrifying, for they are part of our history, and remembering them is the only way to honor those who suffered. If you found this story informative and compelling, please subscribe to Tales Never Told. This channel is dedicated to unearthing forbidden history, dark folklore, and unsolved mysteries, and bringing those long-buried stories to life. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you will never miss a new episode. Thank you for listening, and remember, the past may be hidden, but tales never told will continue to shine a light in even the darkest of places. Until next time, stay safe and keep the fire of curiosity alive.